So as we were talking about before, with backward design, there's some logic that goes into that. And as was mentioned at the end of the last video, when you're talking about backward design, you need to make sure you understand what the expectations are, what your expectations are, what sort of evidence are you going to have of student learning, and also what strategies are you going to use, and what strategies are you going to use if they don't understand the information, and talking about varying those. And so the logic of backward design is kind of split into four real chunks here, and the first one is the expectations. So provide clear learning goals. Oftentimes these are listed in elementary classrooms, and even sometimes we've seen them in middle school classrooms listed as I can statements. So I can divide numbers that are multiples of 4. In high school, we typically see them listed more along the lines of the student will or the learner will. So sometimes you see TSW or TLW, and usually they're linked somehow to Bloom's taxonomy. So an example of a learning goal in my classroom right now, we're studying the American Revolution, is the student will, or TSW, be able to analyze founding documents from primary sources and identify key themes that led to the movement for independence. That's for my senior level government class. So providing those clear learning goals and learning targets, as well as giving them models and examples of what you expect them to do. So it's not enough to throw out an assignment and say, I'm going to have you write about Thomas Paine today, and not give them any sort of understanding of what you're looking for, not give them a rubric, or even give them examples of here's a good argument for why Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, here's a bad argument. So those are the kind of things that we typically think of, well, when we get to secondary students, we don't need to do that. And realistically, they probably need it just as much, if not more, as the elementary students who see that on a daily or hourly pace, right? And so then we look at instructions, and I'm not a huge believer in textbooks at the high school level. I know that other people think textbooks are great and they use them only. And UBD really is this push that textbook is one of many resources. So textbooks are written to be used as a guide, to be helpful in determining what you want to teach, when you want to teach it, how things logically flow together. You know, in a math book, for example, it's going to teach you how to add and subtract before it teaches you how to multiply and divide. But the key to it is that a textbook needs to be used just like any other source. It shouldn't be your sole means for the information that you're teaching in your class. And the reason for that is that oftentimes textbooks, are outdated not too long after we get them. And so it's important to supplement the textbook with things like articles, videos, experiences, simulations, guest speakers, all of those things that can help you really create this concrete understanding and knowledge base of the content you want them to get. And then the other thing is we're really seeing this change from teacher-led instruction, direct instruction, stand up in front, lecture for 42 minutes in the high school or middle school, stand up in front of your kids and teach them a reading strategy for 25 minutes in the elementary, those kind of things, to this change to facilitator of learning, which is putting out these deeper, higher order thinking questions and allowing students to have discussions, open-ended discussions between them, with you interjecting when you think something is important. But the key to being a facilitator is making sure you give them the background knowledge on the discussion you're having so that everyone feels like they can actively be involved. And then learning activities are important because learning is active and differentiated. That goes back to the idea of MTSS, or for some of us who don't deal with that on a daily basis, used to be called RTI, right? Multi-tiered systems of support, used to be called response to intervention. And what we want to think about is that learning's active. Learning is not a passive thing like the classrooms of the past. And oftentimes we can think back to when we were in college or high school and we sat there and listened to a teacher speak for 45 minutes and never actively did anything but take notes. Then there was one test at the end, and that was your grade. Active learning can take many different views or standpoints, or can look in many different ways. But it's important to remember that active learning and differentiated learning are very important to understanding. So if you think about differentiation, we've all talked about that and learned that in all of our pre-service things, our undergraduate courses, our teaching experience. And what we find is that it's important to differentiate for the high and low, but it's also equally as important to differentiate for those kids in the middle. And the principals and some of the administration I've worked with in the past have talked about this 10-80-10 rule, saying, right, that the top 10% and the bottom 10% are where we spend most of our time. And really, we need to give equal attention to those kids who fall in that 80% in the middle, making sure that things are differentiated for them, as well as the ability to make it an active learning environment for all students, challenging the top, helping the bottom make up the things that they're lacking, and then creating this safe learning environment for those students in the middle who are really kind of the ones that typically get left out. And then the last part is the assessment. And in UBD, the biggest thing is we don't want any sort of mystery as to what the assessment is going to be covering. Not in terms of, oh, you give the answers out ahead of time, or, oh, you give a study guide. That would defeat the purpose of assessing, right, and seeing what people know. But the key is to that they should know that we learned about these 6 things. Somehow they're going to be on the assessment, whether it's a multiple choice, it's a short answer, it's an essay, it's a performance. So if you're a band teacher, for example, and you've been teaching rhythms, the biggest thing is that assessment at the end, they should know that rhythms is what the assessment is going to be over. Or if you're a science teacher and you're teaching about the process of photosynthesis, they should know that that's going to be what the test, quiz, assessment covers. And the other thing is that students need to be able to demonstrate knowledge through real-world relevant tasks. And that idea is being able to, we used to call it generalization, or the transference of a skill to something that's real-world and relevant. And so in social studies, the example of a debate might be one that is real-world relevant. Why would you say that a debate is real-world relevant when we only see the presidential candidates debating, or politicians debating, or the president of a university debating? Well, the key is that students are going to have discussions and disagreements throughout the entirety of their life, and they need to be able to use those skills that they acquired and demonstrated through that process to show that they truly can use evidence to back up their arguments, make an argument against someone's standpoint by arguing the standpoint, not the person. Those kind of skills that would be taught through real-world acquisition. Okay, so now we get to the template. And the template you can find in your textbook. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. You can see my notes here as to what we have. But stage 1 is really clarifying the desired results, as we mentioned before. We talked about understanding having 2 general connotations, applying the understanding, knowledge, and skill to a new and unfamiliar situation, which we call transference or transfer skills, generalization if you worked your undergrad a while ago. And then making inferences and grasping connections. And that's one that we notice students from K through 12 really struggle with, making inferences and grasping certain connections, especially in areas that are a little more abstract. So if it's not a concrete principle like Newton's first law, or multiplication, or the idea of how to read a certain sentence or poem, to where it's more make a connection between Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. Make a connection between Martin Luther King's thoughts and those expressed in To Kill a Mockingbird. Those kind of things students often struggle with, and that's where this template can really help you design instruction to make sure they're learning what they need to learn to make those connections. So 4 main areas you really want to consider when you're doing that are transfer, like we talked about. Can they take it from one situation to another that's new and unfamiliar? Meanings. Can they take meanings, understand them, break them down, and apply them? Acquisition of knowledge. What knowledge is it that you want them to gain? What knowledge are they gaining? And how are they acquiring it? What process, what teaching strategy is working? And then you look at the standards and the other established goals, like your essential questions and your learning targets, and you ensure that those things are leading towards the understanding that you want. And remember, back to that definition, that understanding is a deeper level. It's not the base level. It's not the top coat. It's the really digging in and understanding how things work. So transfer, like we talked about, is the ability to transfer knowledge from short-term to long-term memory, especially in the overarching goal of understanding. And then the application, like I mentioned before, generalization. I'm currently working on my dissertation, and it's about transference of skills and knowledge acquired by students using graphic organizers. And so the idea is, can students take the knowledge they learn in a graphic organizer and apply it not only to that knowledge level, the understanding or identifying level, demonstrating or identifying level, but to that longer understanding, higher, deeper order thinking. And that's where transfer or transference generalization comes into play. Meaning or essential questions. Essential questions point us in the direction that we need to go, right? So as I mentioned before in my classes, excuse me, each one of my units has 8 to 10 essential questions that are big overlapping themes that are tied directly to the standard of that class and that content, and then tied directly into the learning target, which in turn drives my instruction. And so I use those essential questions and learning targets as checkpoints, as ways to ensure that my students are getting the knowledge they need to get, so that when I give them the assessment at the end, everything matches up and they can have an adequate chance of demonstrating their knowledge. And then applying knowledge and understanding of prior activities. That's something we find a lot of times that students are missing, right? It's that prior knowledge, and it's equally important for us to give them the prior knowledge that they need. So if you're going to talk about a court case, a Supreme Court case, it's important that the students understand what the amendment's about, what the law was about that was being argued, not just here it is, read it, and let's discuss it. So giving background knowledge is important. And then essential questions are ongoing, and they're guiding, they're pushing students to develop deeper thoughts, deeper thought processes, to dig deeper into information, and to question and say, why is it that way? Or why have we always done it that way? So essential questions are very important in terms of UBD. And then acquisition, like I mentioned before, short-term goals is for students to gain knowledge and skill, whereas the long-term goal is for them to be able to demonstrate understanding through those variety of things using essential questions, learning targets, teacher instruction, all in kind of this circular flow to give them the ability to demonstrate their understanding of a topic, to dive deeper, to have those higher ordered thinking discussions and answers, and to, in most cases, demonstrate an acquired skill through some sort of authentic task. And then standards and other established goals, mentioned this several times. Standards, objectives, benchmarks that are used in making decisions in terms of assessment, instruction, and teaching strategies should be thought of as all interconnected. And that was that circular flow that I just mentioned. And you may have to unpack the standards. My district spent the first 3 years I was there unpacking standards, putting them into a curriculum manager that's called Atlas Rubicon. Some of you might be using MISIC, to truly look at what are our priority standards, where are they being taught, do we have any gaps in our instruction, and that's equally as important for you to look at each class you teach and say, what am I missing? Where do I need to add? Where do I need to take away? Are they learning about dinosaurs 7 grades in a row and they're never touching on geothermal principles or something like that? So it's important to make sure your essential questions are guiding you to cover each of the standards. Okay, so stage 2 is determining the needed evidence, and we talked about this before. So you have to think of yourself like you're an assessor. What am I seeing? How can it get better? How do I make it better? And teachers should expect students to be flexible and intellectually use what they know. So what do you know? How can you apply it? What do we need to do to add to that? And then the other part is it's important to remember that isolated or discrete tests of knowledge don't really work. So to give them a pop quiz over something that you spent 30 seconds on or 10 minutes on the day before, but it's not connected to your teaching standards, really doesn't give them the chance to demonstrate the skills, but it also doesn't give you the opportunity to appropriately teach the skill and the standard. And I know oftentimes we think about, I know how we'll get those kids back for not paying attention. We'll give them a really hard quiz tomorrow. And most teachers would sometime in their life say, yep, I've thought about doing that. And really, what does that do? It doesn't allow them to demonstrate any knowledge, really makes them kind of offended by you. And so there are more effective classroom management techniques than giving a quiz like that, especially in terms of understanding that that isn't a summative assessment and it isn't a fair assessment. It doesn't give you the knowledge that you need of what those students know.